The sun had just risen above the small town and the streets were quiet. On the corner of Main Street stood an old diner, its red sign flickering from time to time. The diner was not fancy, but it was known to locals for its warm meals, hot coffee, and friendly staff. Every morning, regular customers came in, and one of them was an elderly man named Thomas. Thomas was in his late 70s, his hair gray and thin, but his back still straight. His walk was slow, but it carried a kind of dignity. He wore a simple jacket with a small badge pinned to the front. Few people noticed the badge, but those who did knew it was a medal from his service in the military. Thomas was a veteran who had served the country many years ago, and though he never bragged, the stories of his bravery were known to some of the older townsfolk. That morning, Thomas pushed open the door of the diner. The bell above the door rang, and the smell of coffee and eggs filled the air. The waitress, a kind woman named Mary, smiled warmly at him. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," she said. "Good morning, Mary," he replied, his voice calm and gentle. He made his way to his usual booth near the window. From there, he liked to watch people pass by on the street as he enjoyed his breakfast. The diner was filling up quickly. Some workers in uniforms grabbed quick meals before heading to their jobs. A couple of families sat with children laughing over pancakes. The room was alive with chatter, but Thomas enjoyed the noise. It reminded him that life went on with energy and hope. Not long after, the door opened again, and in came a young man named Rick. He was tall, broad, and had an air of arrogance around him. Rick was known in town for his loud mouth and sharp temper. Many people avoided him because he often tried to show his strength by belittling others. Today, his mood seemed no different. He walked in with heavy steps, his eyes scanning the diner as if he owned the place. Rick sat at a table not far from Thomas. He ordered his food quickly and looked around, tapping the table impatiently. His eyes finally landed on Thomas sitting alone, quietly sipping his coffee. A smirk appeared on Rick's face. For reasons no one understood, Rick always found joy in mocking those weaker or older than him. As Thomas cut into his toast, Rick raised his voice so that others could hear. "Old man still coming here every morning?" Rick said, laughing. "You should be at home resting, not wasting space in a diner." A few heads turned, and the chatter in the diner grew quieter. Some people frowned, but no one spoke. Thomas kept calm, placing his fork down slowly. He looked at Rick with steady eyes, but he did not reply. Rick leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention. He took another jab. "What's that shiny thing on your jacket? Did you buy it at a store? Or is it just decoration?" He laughed again, trying to provoke a reaction. Mary, the waitress, quickly stepped in. "Rick, that's enough." "Leave him alone," she said firmly, but Rick only waved his hand. "Relax, I'm just having fun," he replied. His eyes still fixed on Thomas as if daring him to answer back. Thomas remained silent. He had faced far worse in his life and knew better than to waste words on someone looking for trouble. His calmness only seemed to make Rick angrier. The air inside the diner grew tense. Families stopped eating. Workers paused mid-bite. Everyone was waiting, uncertain about what might happen next. Thomas reached again for his coffee, his hand steady, his eyes peaceful. Rick slammed his hand on the table, startling those around him. "Hey, old man, don't ignore me when I'm talking," he barked. His tone was sharp, his pride hurt by the silence of the veteran. Thomas finally spoke, his voice low but strong. "Respect is something you give, not something you demand." The words hung in the air, heavy and meaningful. Some people in the diner nodded quietly, admiring the veteran's calm courage. But Rick's face turned red with anger. He did not like being challenged, not even with words as simple as those. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stepped closer to Thomas's booth, his shadow falling over the old man. The diner held its breath, waiting to see what Rick would do. And in that tense moment, no one could have guessed how this simple breakfast would change the lives of everyone inside. The diner was silent. Forks and knives rested on plates, and coffee cups remained untouched. All eyes were fixed on Rick standing tall over Thomas, his face twisted with pride and anger. The hum of the diner, so lively a few minutes ago, now felt heavy with tension. Thomas stayed seated, his hands resting calmly on the table. His eyes met Rick's without fear, steady like a man who had faced storms far stronger than the arrogance of a young bully. The silence only seemed to make Rick more impatient. He wanted a reaction, something to prove his control. "Answer me properly, old man," Rick demanded, his voice sharp. Do you even understand who you're talking to? Thomas did not raise his voice. He spoke with the same calm tone. I understand enough, he said. I see a man trying to measure himself by hurting others. That is not strength. That is weakness, gasps spread across the diner. People glanced at each other, unsure of what might come next. Mary stepped forward quickly, her hands shaking. She was worried about Thomas, but also about the peace of the diner. Rick, sit back down, she said firmly. You're disturbing everyone. If you don't behave, I'll have to ask you to leave. Rick turned his head toward her, his smirk returning. You think you can throw me out? This is a public place. I can sit wherever I want. His voice carried arrogance, but his eyes returned to Thomas. The veteran's calmness bothered him more than Mary's warning. Rick leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Thomas could hear, but the anger still showed in his eyes. I don't care how many years you've lived. If you don't show me respect, I'll make sure everyone knows who's in charge here. Thomas's gaze did not waver. He said nothing, letting the weight of silence fall again. That silence was not weakness. It was discipline, the same discipline he had carried in his years of service. The silence only fueled Rick's frustration. He raised his voice again, looking around at the other customers. Look at him. He thinks he's better than everyone because he's old and wears a shiny badge. He doesn't even answer when I talk to him. The room was filled with unease. Families looked down at their plates. Some workers whispered to one another. Nobody wanted to step into the fight. Yet many of them wished Rick would just leave. Mary tried again, her voice louder this time. Rick, enough. Go back to your table. Rick ignored her completely. He pulled out the chair opposite Thomas and sat down, leaning forward across the table. Tell me, old man, he sneered. What makes you so calm? You think people respect you? You're nothing. Thomas's face softened slightly, not with fear, but with pity. I don't need to prove anything to you, he said. Respect is not earned by noise. It is earned by deeds. The words struck deeper than Rick expected. His smirk faltered for a moment, but pride quickly returned. He pushed the table slightly with his arm, the plates and cups rattling. Some coffee spilled over the side, dripping onto the floor. Deeds, Rick repeated mockingly. You think serving long ago makes you special now? This is today, old man. Nobody cares about the past. At another booth, an older man whispered to his wife, That's Thomas. He served in the war. He's a hero. The woman nodded, her eyes worried as if she feared Rick might not understand what kind of man he was provoking. Thomas finally leaned back in his seat, his voice still steady. If nobody cared about the past, then people like you would not enjoy the freedom to speak this way. That freedom was earned by the deeds of many, not by words of anger. The diner grew quiet again. Rick's eyes burned with frustration. He had expected Thomas to tremble or back down, but instead the old man spoke with wisdom that cut through arrogance like a blade. Rick clenched his jaw. He did not like being challenged in front of an audience. Standing up again, he glared at Thomas. I don't need a history lesson from you, he snapped. You'll learn soon enough that words don't protect you. With that, Rick stepped away, pacing near his table. He grabbed his plate roughly, shoving food into his mouth, his eyes still darting back to Thomas. The veteran, however, returned to his toast and coffee as if nothing had happened. His calm presence felt stronger than Rick's noise, and some of the customers began to whisper words of quiet respect. Mary walked over to Thomas, her voice soft. I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas, he's always causing trouble. Don't let his words bother you. Thomas gave a small smile. Do not worry, Mary. I have faced worse storms than this. But deep inside the diner, an unseen wave was building. The customers, the staff, and even Rick himself did not realize that this simple morning argument would grow into something far greater than anyone expected. The diner slowly returned to its usual noise, but the air was still uneasy. Customers spoke in hushed voices, and children who had been laughing earlier now sat quietly, sensing something tense had passed. Though Rick had gone back to his table, his glare toward Thomas had not faded. Everyone could feel that he was not finished. Thomas, however, carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. He calmly cut his toast and sipped his coffee. Years of discipline had taught him patience, and he was not about to lose it over a young man's anger. Rick tapped his fork against his plate, his mind turning with pride and irritation. The more Thomas ignored him, the smaller he felt, and he could not stand that feeling. In his world, silence was an insult, and he believed he had to prove his strength no matter what. At the counter, Mary whispered to the cook, an older man named Joe. "He's going to cause more trouble." "I can see it in his eyes," Joe nodded grimly. "Thomas doesn't deserve this. He's one of the finest men I know." "Rick better be careful," Mary sighed. "I wish someone would step in, but people are afraid of Rick's temper." At a nearby booth, a young man named Daniel sat quietly, watching everything. He was new in town, and unlike most of the regulars, he did not know Thomas personally. But he had listened carefully to the way Thomas spoke and the way others respected him. Something about the old man's calmness touched him. Meanwhile, Rick stood up again, unable to sit still. He walked toward Thomas's booth, his boots clicking loudly on the floor. The chatter inside the diner once again faded into silence. Everyone knew trouble was returning. Rick leaned against the table, his arms crossed. "You think you're wise, don't you?" he said, his tone filled with challenge. "But wisdom doesn't matter when people like me make the rules." Thomas looked up, his expression steady. "You may think you make the rules, but the truth is, respect decides who leads and who follows." Rick laughed loudly, though there was no joy in it. "Respect? Nobody respects me because they're afraid of me. That's enough. Fear is power." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Fear is not power. Fear is weakness pretending to be strong. Power is when people stand with you, not when they hide from you." The words seemed to echo across the diner. Some of the customers nodded quietly, inspired by the old man's wisdom. Rick, however, grew more restless. His pride could not accept losing the attention of the room to a man he called weak. He slammed his hand on Thomas's table, making the cups shake. "You talk too much, old man," he said sharply. Daniel, the young man sitting nearby, finally stood. His voice was careful but clear. "Leave him alone, Rick. He's not hurting anyone." Rick turned his head quickly, his eyes narrowing.
"Stay out of this, boy."
"You don't know who you're talking to." Daniel did not back down. "I know enough. Picking on someone older doesn't make you strong. It makes you look small." The diner grew tense again. Some people looked at Daniel with surprise. Few had ever dared to stand against Rick, but Daniel's words carried courage. Rick stepped toward Daniel, his fists clenched. "You think you're brave? Do you want me to show you what happens to people who interfere?" Before Daniel could answer, Thomas spoke once more, his voice calm but firm. "Rick, you are only proving what I said. You mistake fear for power. If you truly wanted respect, you would learn to control yourself." Rick turned back to Thomas, his face red with anger. He had reached the edge of his patience. His pride, his need for control, and the silence of the veteran all pressed on him like weight. In a burst of frustration, he raised his hand and struck Thomas across the face. The sound echoed through the diner. Gasps filled the air. Cups rattled and chairs scraped as people shifted in shock. The veteran's head turned slightly from the blow, but he did not fall. Slowly, Thomas straightened, his hand resting on the table, his eyes still steady. Mary cried out, rushing forward. "Rick, that's enough! Get out!" But Rick stood tall, his chest rising and falling with pride. He looked around, expecting to see fear in every face. Instead, he saw shock, anger, and disappointment. The room no longer looked at him with fear, but with judgment. Thomas lifted his hand slowly and wiped the corner of his mouth. His calmness after the strike unsettled Rick more than anything else. "You have shown your strength," Thomas said quietly, "but in truth, you have only shown your weakness." For the first time, Rick did not know how to answer. The diner remained silent and everyone waited, hearts pounding, for what would happen next. What no one realized was that this single moment, this single act, had set in motion events far greater than Rick could ever imagine. The diner was frozen in silence. The sound of Rick's hand striking Thomas still seemed to echo in the minds of everyone present. Families stared in shock. The workers clenched their jaws, and Mary stood frozen, her tray trembling in her hands. Thomas did not rise from his seat. His face carried no anger, only calm strength.
He had endured pain before, far worse than this.
The strike was not the true wound. The true wound was the disrespect shown to the values he had fought to protect all his life. Rick stood tall, his chest proud, his eyes scanning the room. He expected to see fear, but instead he saw the opposite. The crowd was against him now. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men shook their heads, and older folks muttered about the shame of such behavior. "Out," Mary said sharply, her voice filled with courage now. "You crossed the line, Rick. Get out of my diner before I call the police." Rick laughed coldly. "Police for a slap? Don't waste your time." Nobody will care, but deep down Rick was uneasy. The silence after his act was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of judgment. He looked back at Thomas, expecting him to be weak or humiliated, but the veteran's steady eyes pierced through his pride. "You think this makes you strong," Thomas said softly. "But strength without honor is emptiness. You will understand one day, though it may be too late." The words struck deeper than the slap itself. Rick turned away quickly, trying to hide his discomfort. He went back to his table and grabbed his jacket roughly. As he walked to the door, Daniel spoke again. "Remember this, Rick, everyone here saw what you did. You'll carry that shame, not him." Rick spun around, glaring at Daniel. "You'll regret opening your mouth," he snapped, pointing a finger. But Daniel did not flinch, and the customers behind him stood a little taller, showing they were no longer afraid of the bully. With a final growl of anger, Rick pushed open the door and stormed out of the diner. The bell above the door rang loudly as it swung back, and then the room finally released its breath. Mary hurried to Thomas's side. "Are you all right, Mr. Thomas?" she asked, her eyes filled with worry. Thomas gave her a small smile. "I am fine, Mary. I have faced worse. Do not let this trouble you." Joe, the cook, came out from behind the counter and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You handled yourself with more dignity than anyone else could. That boy has no idea who he's dealing with." Thomas shook his head gently. "It does not matter who I am. What matters is that people like him learn respect before they destroy themselves." At the next booth, Daniel finally spoke up, his voice respectful. "Sir, I don't know you well, but I want to say, I admire how you kept your calm. Most people would have fought back." Thomas looked at him kindly. "Young man, fighting is easy. Resisting the urge to fight when your pride is attacked is the harder battle. That is the battle of discipline." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the lesson in his words. Around the diner, others began to return to their meals. But the air was still filled with awe at the strength Thomas had shown. After a while, Thomas finished his coffee and stood up. He paid his bill, leaving a small tip on the counter as always. Mary tried to insist the meal was free, but Thomas only smiled. Rules are rules. Even small ones matter. As he stepped out of the diner, the autumn air greeted him with a cool breeze. The street was quiet, but Thomas's mind was thoughtful. He knew the incident was not truly over. A young man like Rick, burning with arrogance and anger, would not simply walk away. Trouble had a way of returning. What Thomas did not know was that his quiet dignity had been witnessed by more than just the people inside the diner. A stranger sitting in the far corner had taken a few notes on a small pad. He wore plain clothes, but his sharp eyes suggested he was more than just another customer. This man quietly stood, paid his bill, and left the diner a few minutes after Thomas. He had recognized the old veteran. He knew the name Thomas carried weight in places far beyond that small town. And he also knew that the incident inside the diner would soon connect to someone powerful, someone who would not take kindly to an insult against his father. The day carried on as usual for most of the town, but unseen wheels had already begun to turn. Rick believed he had walked away victorious, but he had unknowingly stepped into a storm that would soon change his life forever. Rick stormed down the street after leaving the diner, his fists clenched, his thoughts burning with anger. The slap he had delivered to Thomas gave him a brief sense of control, but it was fading quickly. Deep inside, he knew the looks of the people inside the diner were not fear but judgment. That unsettled him, though he refused to admit it. He muttered under his breath as he walked. "Old man trying to act wise. Everyone watching me like I'm the villain. They'll see. Nobody makes a fool of me." Rick kicked a stone across the pavement, his steps heavy. He did not notice the man in plain clothes who followed him from a distance, watching carefully. This man had been at the diner, and he had recognized Thomas immediately. He now carried a quiet purpose, knowing he needed to make a call. Meanwhile, Thomas walked slowly down another street, his steps steady as always. Though his cheek was slightly red from the strike, his spirit was unshaken. He had faced battlefields where lives hung in the balance. One man's arrogance could not shake him. As he walked, his thoughts drifted not to himself but to his family. His son David lived far away, working in a position of responsibility that few fully understood. Thomas rarely spoke of his son's job because David's work required silence and discipline. All most people knew was that David served the country in an important role, just as his father once had. Back at the diner, Mary and Joe tried to calm the customers who were still unsettled. "It's over now," Mary said, though her own heart was still uneasy. Mr. Thomas is strong. He'll be fine. Daniel, however, remained thoughtful. That Rick won't let it end here, he said quietly. He has too much pride. He'll look for another way to prove himself. Joe nodded. You may be right. But Thomas is not a man who stands alone. He has friends in places Rick cannot even imagine. Mary frowned, not understanding what Joe meant, but she trusted the older cook's words. At that very hour, the man in plain clothes reached a quiet office on the edge of town. He entered, sat at his desk, and picked up the phone. After dialing a secure line, he spoke clearly. This is Agent Miller. I have something important to report. The incident involves a decorated veteran named Thomas. He was harassed this morning in public. More than that, he was struck by a man named Rick. Considering the veteran's identity, I believe his son should be informed immediately. On the other end of the line, silence followed for a moment before a reply came. Understood. We will take it from here. Agent Miller placed the phone down, his expression calm. He knew what would come next. Thomas's son was not an ordinary man. He was the head of Homeland Security, a man whose duty was to protect the nation from threats both inside and outside. The moment he learned that his father had been insulted and attacked, action would surely follow. Meanwhile, Rick had gathered with two of his friends outside a small store. He told the story in his own way, making himself sound like the victor. The old man didn't even fight back, Rick bragged. One slap and he just sat there like a weakling. Everyone saw it, his friends laughed but uneasily. One of them said, People respect that old guy, Rick. Maybe you went too far this time. Rick waved his hand dismissively. Respect, please. They'll forget about it by tomorrow. I showed them who's in charge. But even as he said it, a small doubt gnawed at him. The calm look in Thomas's eyes refused to leave his memory. It was not the look of a broken man. It was the look of someone who knew something Rick did not. Back at Thomas's modest home, the veteran placed his jacket carefully on the hanger and sat in his chair by the window. He watched the street outside, his face peaceful. He had not called his son about the incident. He did not believe in troubling David with small matters. But life has a way of carrying stories farther than we intend. Far away in a secure building filled with screens and guards, David received the message about his father. His heart tightened as he read the report. He was not just a son in that moment. He was a protector, and no matter how disciplined he tried to be, no one insulted his father without consequences. The quiet balance of the town was about to shift. Rick thought he had silenced a veteran, but he had unknowingly awakened a power far beyond his understanding. David sat in his office, the report about his father open in front of him. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He read every detail carefully. The fact that his father, Thomas, had been struck in a public diner was serious. It was not just an attack on an elderly man. It was an insult to the values Thomas had dedicated his life to protect. David leaned back in his chair, thinking. His father had always taught him discipline, patience, and courage. Those lessons had guided him through every decision in his career. But now the situation was personal. He could not ignore it. He pressed a button on his desk. Bring me all information on Rick, he said to the assistant who had entered. Where does he live, his friends, his habits, everything we can find? The assistant nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I'll have the files ready in 20 minutes. David's mind was already moving faster than most people could follow. He did not intend to make rash decisions. He wanted to understand the situation fully. But one thing was certain. Rick had to learn a lesson about respect, and he had underestimated Thomas completely. Meanwhile, Rick had returned to his small apartment, still feeling the frustration of the morning. He paced back and forth, repeating the events in his mind. He didn't even fight back, Rick muttered angrily. Just sat there, like he didn't care. His friend sat nearby, uneasy at the way he was speaking. One of them said, Rick, maybe you should just forget about it. It's an old man. Rick stopped pacing and glared. Forget about it, never.
Do you understand?
Nobody disrespects me and gets away with it. But even as he said it, the memory of Thomas's calm eyes made his confidence falter slightly. He could not admit it, not even to himself. The old man's strength was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there, unshakable. Back at the diner, life had returned to normal on the surface. Customers came and went, enjoying their breakfasts and lunches. Mary wiped down the tables, her hands still shaking slightly from the morning's tension. Joe prepared the orders in silence, thinking about how Thomas had handled the situation. Daniel sat at his booth, thinking too. He had learned something important that day. Courage and patience could be stronger than anger and strength. He wondered if he would ever face a situation like that, and if he would have the same control Thomas had shown. Meanwhile, Thomas sat in his favorite chair at home, reflecting on the morning. He had never been a man to boast about his past. He knew that respect was earned by deeds, not words, yet he also knew that some people, like Rick, needed to learn lessons the hard way. As the sun began to set, David finally reviewed the files on Rick. The young man was known for arrogance, quick anger, and a tendency to underestimate others. His friends were mostly casual, not very disciplined. David shook his head slightly. It was clear that Rick had never been confronted by anyone who would not fear him. Thomas had done what most could not. He had remained calm in the face of aggression. David picked up his phone. "Set up a meeting," he said quietly, his mind focused. "I want to talk to Rick, personally. Make sure it's controlled, secure. No surprises for either side." Within a short time, his team prepared everything. They knew that the son of Thomas, head of Homeland Security, did not act lightly. If David had decided to intervene, it would be precise, disciplined, and effective. Rick, unaware of what was happening behind the scenes, spent the evening trying to convince his friends to support his arrogance. But even they noticed he was quieter than usual, the weight of Thomas's calm strength pressing on him in ways he did not fully understand. Thomas looked out the window from his home, the evening light soft on his face. He did not know that David was already taking steps to ensure that respect and order were restored. He trusted his son as always, but he did not need to involve him unless necessary. Unseen, a storm was gathering. It was not violent in the way Rick expected. It was quiet, controlled, and inevitable, and soon it would reach him in a way he could not avoid. The morning's simple slap in a small diner had set off a chain of events far greater than anyone could have imagined. The next morning, Rick arrived at the diner still fuming from the events of the previous day. He believed that showing up again would assert his dominance, that people would finally fear him. His friends followed, nervous but curious, unsure of what might happen. Inside the diner, Mary and Joe were already preparing for the day. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, and a few early customers were seated quietly. Thomas entered slowly, his steps steady and calm as he did every morning. His eyes were gentle but alert, scanning the room without fear. Rick froze when he saw Thomas. The old man's calm presence was just as intimidating as yesterday, if not more. For a moment, Rick felt a flicker of doubt. He had not expected Thomas to return so composed. "Morning, Rick," Thomas said quietly, his voice calm and steady. "I hope you slept well." Rick laughed, though it sounded forced. "I'm here to show you—" "I'm not afraid," he said, trying to sound confident. Thomas nodded slightly, still seated at his usual booth. "I never doubted that you are bold," he said. "But boldness without wisdom can be dangerous." Rick's friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. No one spoke, and the diner's usual chatter was gone. Every eye was on Thomas and Rick. Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up outside. David stepped out, calm and composed, dressed neatly but carrying an authority that demanded attention. He had arrived quietly, without announcing himself, but his presence was immediately felt. Rick noticed the car first. He laughed nervously to hide his unease. "Who's that?" he muttered under his breath. Inside, Thomas looked up at the diner window and smiled faintly. "That is my son," he said softly, "and he is not someone who ignores disrespect." David walked into the diner, his steps measured and confident. He nodded to the staff and then approached Thomas's booth. "Good morning, Father," he said. His eyes were gentle when they met Thomas's, but when they turned toward Rick, they were sharp and commanding. Rick suddenly felt small. He had faced people in arguments before, but none like this. David's calm authority was a force he could not challenge with arrogance. "Who's this?" Rick demanded, trying to regain control. "This is David," Thomas said simply. "He is my son, and he has been informed of yesterday's events." Rick's confidence faltered. He had assumed no one powerful would care about an incident in a small diner. Now he realized he had underestimated Thomas completely. David looked at Rick calmly. "You struck my father in public," he said quietly. That is unacceptable. You humiliated yourself more than anyone else. Respect is not demanded with force. It is earned with behavior. Rick opened his mouth, but words failed him. The room seemed to close in. Every customer, every worker, watched in awe as the young man, calm and disciplined, confronted him with a power far greater than anything Rick had expected. You must understand, David continued, that actions have consequences. What you did yesterday will not go unnoticed. You will have the chance to make amends, but arrogance and disrespect cannot continue. Rick's face turned red. He tried to speak, to argue, but no words came out. He realized he had been completely outmatched not by anger, but by calm authority. Thomas placed a hand on David's shoulder. "It is enough, son," he said softly. He must see the lesson without fear turning into punishment. David nodded. He turned back to Rick. "Leave the diner now. Think about your behavior. Return only when you have learned to respect others." "That is all I ask." Rick stumbled backward, his pride shattered. Without another word, he turned and left the diner, his friends trailing behind him in silence. No one spoke, but the lesson had been made clear. Inside the diner, a sense of peace returned. The customers quietly resumed their breakfasts. Mary poured coffee for Thomas, smiling. "Everything is fine now," she said. Thomas nodded, his calm strength returning the room to a sense of normalcy. "It is not about being feared," he said quietly. "It is about being respected." Today that was restored. David placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You taught me courage and patience," he said softly. "But sometimes others must learn the lesson as well." Thomas smiled. "And they did," he said, his eyes twinkling with quiet pride. Outside, the autumn wind carried the last of Rick's arrogance away, leaving behind a quiet town where respect and dignity had been quietly restored. After Rick and his friends left the diner, the atmosphere inside slowly returned to normal. The clatter of plates and the hiss of the coffee machine filled the air once again. Customers whispered quietly to each other, exchanging glances that carried respect and awe for Thomas. Some had been frightened by the confrontation, but now they felt inspired. Thomas sat quietly at his booth, sipping his coffee. His face was calm, his posture steady. He had endured the worst of human nature, and today was no different. The incident had reminded him that patience and dignity were always stronger than anger. David stood beside his father, watching the calm scene. Though he could have reacted more forcefully, he knew that restraint often had greater power than action. He placed a hand gently on Thomas's shoulder. "Father, you handled yourself perfectly," he said softly. "I only intervened to ensure the lesson was clear. Some people need to understand the consequences of their actions before they can learn respect." Thomas smiled at his son. "You were right to come, David," he said. "Sometimes even the strongest must show authority. But kindness and patience guide the world better than force." Mary, still behind the counter, poured an extra cup of coffee for Thomas. "I have never seen anything like that before," she said quietly. "Most people would have lost their temper, but you were calm through it all." Thomas shook his head. "Anger can cloud judgment," he said. "Control and discipline give clarity. That is what I learned in service, and that is what I try to live by every day." Daniel, the young man who had first stood up to Rick, approached the booth. "Sir, I want to thank you," he said. "I learned something important today. Courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about standing firm, staying calm, and showing respect." Thomas looked at him kindly. "You are wise beyond your years, Daniel," he said. "Remember this lesson. Strength without respect is empty, but respect carried with courage can change the world." Outside, the autumn sun shone softly on the small town. The events of the morning seemed almost distant now, but their impact lingered in the hearts of those who had witnessed them. Rick, meanwhile, walked through the streets, his mind heavy. He had learned that arrogance and force were not the measures of strength. Today had humbled him in a way he would not forget. David stayed with his father for a while longer, enjoying the quiet moment. He had returned to the diner not just to defend his father, but also to reinforce the lessons of patience, wisdom, and respect. The old veteran had taught him well, and now he had a chance to demonstrate that those lessons were alive in the next generation. As Thomas left the diner later that morning, he walked slowly down the street, nodding to familiar faces along the way. People smiled and waved, offering quiet gratitude for the dignity he had shown. The town felt safer somehow, as if the lesson of respect and honor had settled into its streets. David followed a few steps behind, keeping a watchful eye but not interfering. He trusted his father and the community they were part of. He knew that courage and discipline were stronger than fear and anger, and he saw that clearly in the way people treated Thomas with admiration and warmth. Rick's behavior would be remembered, but not with fear. It would serve as a quiet warning of what arrogance and disrespect could bring. Thomas had shown that dignity could stand against aggression. David had shown that authority, when guided by respect, could restore order without cruelty. By the evening, the diner had returned to its normal rhythm. Coffee flowed, plates clattered, and the laughter of children returned. But the story of the morning would remain in the hearts of those who witnessed it. It was a story of courage, patience, and respect, a reminder that true strength lies in self-control and honor. Thomas and David walked together, father and son, through the streets of the town. The sun set behind them, casting long shadows, but their path was bright. They knew that while life would bring more challenges, the lessons of respect, courage, and patience would guide them always. And in that quiet town, the memory of a small diner confrontation became more than just an incident. It became a story of strength, humility, and the power of standing with honor. The town would not forget the day the bully learned a lesson, and the veteran and his son reminded everyone that dignity and respect always prevail.